Hi, U.S. History. We are back from spring break. This week, we're going to continue talking about the Vietnam War. Remember, we started the Vietnam War right before we went on break a couple of weeks ago. And that first lecture on the Vietnam War was basically just kind of an introduction to how this thing started. Remember, we talked about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and how President Kennedy, even before that, had started sending troops over to Vietnam to protect South Vietnam from North Vietnam. And so we kind of set the stage last time and talked about the very start of the war. Today, we're going to review a little bit of that. But we're going to get into kind of the middle portion of the Vietnam War and start to see how opinions on the war, they begin to change. And then by the end of the week, we'll talk about how Nixon ends up bringing an end to the Vietnam War. So today we're going to focus on the middle, and then by the end of the week, we'll focus on the end of the war. So these first two slides in your PowerPoint are essentially review. We covered these before we went on break. But again, since it's been a while, I wanted to just kind of review really quick what is the strategy that each side, North Vietnam and the United States, is using heading into the conflict in 1965. And if you remember, the American military strategy is basically summarized by something called Americanization or Americanizing the war effort, which basically essentially says America needs to be in the forefront of this thing if we're going to win. If we are going to protect South Vietnam from North Vietnam, then America needs to lead the way. We have to be using American weapons, American troops. The South Vietnamese are not able to kind of hold their own or do it on their own in order to be successful. America has to do it. That's that idea of Americanize the war. So even though this is a war really between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, because South Vietnam isn't able to protect themselves, it becomes an Americanized conflict, okay? And Americanization really takes three different forms. Remember, our military strategy has three different forms. The first one, the most predominant form, is definitely bombs. We have a lot of aerial bombing all over North Vietnam and parts of South Vietnam as well. Remember, we dropped 3 times as many bombs on North Vietnam as all of the bombs dropped by everybody during World War II, which is crazy to think about. So lots and lots of bombing going on constantly throughout the country of Vietnam in these war years. The second part of our Americanization strategy, so you have bombs, the next part is actually chemical warfare. Remember, the intent of these chemical warfare, these weapons that we use, they're both herbicides. They were meant to kill off all of the jungles, that really thick jungle that makes it difficult for the Americans to see and move around in Vietnam. The intent was to kill away all that foliage and all those plants so that they could fight the war more effectively. But remember, you have civilians who are living in these jungles. You have these village communities, and so this becomes an aspect of chemical warfare. Even though it's intended just to kill off all the plants, it ends up having a lot of negative effects on people as well. So you have chemical warfare, largely with the use of Agent Orange and napalm. Those were the 2 weapons or herbicides that we talked about last time. And then the third part of the American strategy is just send in lots and lots and lots of troops. Remember, we send over about 2 million troops to Vietnam between 1964 and 1973. So in about 10 years, about 2 million troops, which we're going to see today is a big cause for why Americans start to turn against the Vietnam War. We just send in so many people to a really, really small country, okay? So that was America's strategy. What is North Vietnam's strategy going into this war? Remember, they know Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam, he basically knows, like, listen, we're just not going to win this thing against America. We don't match up with them in terms of their wealth, their population, their military prowess. We just don't match up. And so what we're going to do is basically use guerrilla warfare, turn this into a war of attrition, and just keep fighting and fighting and fighting until eventually they get sick of it and they just kind of give up. Remember, that's Ho Chi Minh's strategy. And so he basically just uses guerrilla warfare tactics, hiding people in the jungle, remember, using children sometimes, doing all of these different types of things, basically just to wear down the Americans and kind of catch them off of their guard. They build tunnels, they have booby traps, they like to fight at night, again, to kind of take them off their guard. It's harder to see at night. And so this is Ho Chi Minh's strategy. He's not going to lead big offensive. He's just going to wear them down slowly until eventually, basically, America says, that's enough. We don't care anymore. We're going to give up, okay? And we're going to see today that this was actually really, actually really successful against the United States. Despite our very best efforts, I mean, think again of all of the troops that we're sending over. You have chemical warfare going on, all of the bombs. Despite all of that, we are just unable to get the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese to surrender. They just won't do it. They just keep coming back. Every time we have all these bombs being set off and we think, okay, this was it. They're not going to come back from this. They pop up again and they launch a new attack somewhere else. And so we're just unable to wear them down the way that they're wearing us down. And so we respond by sending even more troops over. The question becomes, how do we get to that 2 million mark within 10 years? I mean, that's a lot of troops that we're sending over to Vietnam. The reason that we're sending so many troops over there is because, again, they just keep coming back and giving us something new. And so we keep thinking, okay, well, if we can just send over more troops and more troops, eventually we're going to overwhelm them and we'll make some progress on this thing, okay? So eventually we keep doing this over and over, but because of the nature of the fighting, again, we've talked about this, because it's largely fought at night, because it's being fought in jungles and in forests, it's really hard to know who is winning at what time, right? You might have one attack that's super successful, but then maybe you have a couple of others that aren't, and so you're not ever quite sure who is actually winning, and that just makes the conflict go on longer and longer. There's not like decisive victories or surrenders. The way it's fought makes the fighting much less effective. And so this thing just keeps dragging on and on and on. And so we get into about 1967, a couple of years after the war starts. This thing has largely become a stalemate. And that idea of stalemate means that neither side is able to advance. Again, like one side wins one, another side wins the other, and they just kind of one-up each other over and over, but no one's actually winning or kind of coming out on top overall. So by 1967, we have a stalemate. Okay, and this is when we start to see Americans back home start to question the way the war effort is going. In the beginning, LBJ, President Johnson, he has America's support. Remember, we want to contain communism. Everybody's on board. But as we send over more and more and more troops, and there's really no progress, Americans start to question LBJ, his strategy, his goals, his motivation, and just the war effort overall. By 1965, Americans are basically saying, I'm not going to go fight this thing. I'm not going to enlist. And so Americans, by and large, they stop enlisting in the military. Okay? Now, Johnson needs troops. Now, we talked about how we send over lots and lots of troops to Vietnam. So where do we get those troops if they stop enlisting or volunteering? The answer to that question is through the draft, which we've had lots of drafts before. We had one in the Civil War. We had one in World War I and World War II. We've had drafts before. But this one's different because nobody wants to really fight this war anymore, right? So you're sending over lots of troops who don't want to fight, and that's going to spark lots of protests back at home. The other reason why Americans don't like this draft, not only do they not want to fight this war, but they don't like this draft because there are a lot of loopholes. If you were in college, if you came from an influential family, if you were a politician's kid, for instance, then you could be excluded from the draft, which means the only people that are being sent over to Vietnam are people who are from the poor, working classes, or from minority groups in the United States. And so this becomes what we call a poor man's war, right? And so it's unequal in terms of the treatment that the draft and how people are being sent over to Vietnam. And so for that reason, public opinion turns against it really, really fast, and you have widespread protests happening throughout the United States. Now, this is the beginning of the 1960s anti-war movement, which we're going to talk about more throughout the week. You guys are going to listen to music throughout this week and kind of analyze it in different ways. But this anti-war movement, these protests against the Vietnam War and the draft, they start in college universities all across the United States, but a lot of them on the West Coast. University of Michigan, University of California, Berkeley, they become centers of the anti-war movement, right? So it starts with college kids. Why? Because college kids are the ones who are being drafted and sent over to Vietnam. So it's going to start with them because they are the ones who are most readily impacted by it, okay? In Berkeley, for instance, you have kind of an offshoot of the anti-war movement called the free speech movement, which basically is college students fighting for the right to protest, okay? Because when these protests started, it looked bad for a lot of these colleges, and so UC Berkeley, for instance, they try to put down these protests and get these protesters to stop. But the free speech movement in Berkeley in 1964, it fights for that right to freely protest on college campuses. So they kind of go hand in hand. And as they're successful in Berkeley and Michigan, it starts to spread to other parts of the country as well. And so you basically have protests happening on college campuses throughout the entire nation. And from there, it starts to spread. Remember, we've talked a lot about the significance of television and how television is used to spread images of something that's happening in one part of the country, and then all of a sudden other people join in. Same thing happens with the anti-war movement. You have images on television of the free speech movement at Cal and of all of these anti-war protests. And eventually you have more Americans who, even though they're not college students, are taking on and becoming part of the anti-war movement as well. The other way that television plays a role in this is by actually giving images of what's going on in Vietnam. And so you start to see not only protests happening on college campuses, but you turn on the TV and you see all of these horrendous bombs being dropped and Agent Orange flying behind planes and all of these men coming home with deformities and with injuries. And it just, you're seeing this stuff on the news night after night. It causes more people to turn against the war effort and join the anti-war movement. So television plays a major role, college campuses play a major role, and again, this is really sparked because there's stalemate, nothing is happening in terms of progress, but also people don't want to go and fight this war that they don't think they can win, okay? And so around 1968, the North Vietnamese, they see this kind of turning of the tide in America in terms of morale starting to wane and the anti-war movement picking up steam. And they think, if we can lead a really big attack, a really big offensive, then we can really turn things around for our benefit, okay? And so they launch an attack called the Tet Offensive, okay? Super important. Underline it on your lecture notes if you're taking notes. Write it down and circle it a bunch of times. But the Tet Offensive is a major turning point, and this is, again, a North Vietnamese-led attack against 36 major targets. So they have 36 targets, 5 major cities. They're going to target the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. And the idea was that they're going to finally break America by launching this wide-scale attack. But not only are they going to break America, they're hoping that South Vietnam is going to see how successful it is and basically abandon America and just join them. Okay, so they're thinking maybe this could even bring an end to the war. It could kick out the Americans and get South Vietnam on our side. Okay, now they are kind of successful, right? The United States is able to kind of thwart some of their efforts, and so while this is a pretty big offensive, it's not as successful as Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong had hoped, but it really doesn't matter. It's still super significant, even though Ho Chi Minh didn't realize all of his goals launching this attack. Okay, so why is the Tet Offensive a turning point? Why is it so significant? The first thing it does is it makes American military leaders realize there is no end in sight to this war, right? They think, remember, that they're making all of these strides and that they're sending over more troops, and eventually America's just gonna win. But the Tet Offensive shows that Ho Chi Minh is always gonna come back for more. So after this, the American military really just kind of realizes this is going nowhere. It's just gonna keep going on and on and on. We're never gonna beat these guys. And so American generals, they start meeting with President Johnson and suggesting to him that they negotiate a peace with Ho Chi Minh, that they start bringing an end to the war diplomatically rather than through the military. Okay, so that's the first reason why it's significant. The second reason why it's significant is because Ho Chi Minh also realizes that he's close and that if he keeps going, that he doesn't have to surrender to the United States, that eventually he's going to get some favorable terms from them because American military leaders, again, are starting to break and realize that they can't win traditionally. So March 1968, at the advice of his military advisors, President Johnson gets on TV and basically announces that he's going to start decreasing the number of troops that are stationed in Vietnam, and that he's going to start speaking with Ho Chi Minh and trying to come up with a settlement to bring an end to the war. He also announces that he's not going to run for another term as president. Remember, he took over for Kennedy after Kennedy was assassinated, okay? And at first, people really like LBJ, but because they've turned against the Vietnam War, they've started to associate the Vietnam War with him. And so people don't like LBJ anymore. And to be honest, LBJ, he is tired. This is way more than he took on, than he thought he was taking on. And so he basically says, listen, I'll finish out this term, but I'm done. And when you guys listen to the music later this week, the anti-war music that I'm assigning you, you're going to hear a lot of the sentiments against LBJ, how negative they are. So this is basically when LBJ just says, listen, we're done, and I'm going to try to bring an end to the Vietnam War as well. So that's it for today. Again, you guys are going to be listening to some music, so I hope you have fun with that. You'll probably recognize a lot of the songs. If you have trouble accessing them, make sure that you reach out to me. But YouTube, Spotify, Pandora, they should all have the songs. They're really famous. Again, you've probably heard a lot of them before. And then at the end of this week, we'll have one more lecture kind of wrapping up the Vietnam War and talking a little bit more about Richard Nixon. So again, I hope you guys had a really good spring break. I hope that you came back refreshed, ready to finish out the fourth quarter and the school year. I miss you guys. Hope you're washing your hands and staying safe.